First story, The Ventura Case, USA, 1962. I was hauling cargo along Route 66 in New Mexico sometime past midnight back in 1962. I remember the day was June 14th because I had circled it in my calendar as the last big run before taking a week off. My rig was a sturdy old truck I'd driven hundreds of times, and I was used to those late-night hauls. The highway was dark, mostly empty, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. It felt almost peaceful at first, just me and the long stretch of road stretching out ahead. I kept glancing at the sky through my windshield, trying to figure out if a storm was rolling in, but the night was strangely clear. There was a big moon out, casting enough light to see the desert on either side of me. I was tired, but not so tired that I'd start hallucinating. I'd done plenty of long-haul trips before, and I knew how to keep my focus. Around that time of night, the air was cool, and I had the window rolled down a crack to keep myself awake, with the breeze. Everything felt routine until I noticed this faint glow through the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just the reflection of my own headlights bouncing off a sign, but it seemed to be coming from above. My heart started thumping a little harder because out on these deserted stretches, you learn to pay attention when something doesn't look right. That's when I saw the shape of 3 distinct orbs, almost like spheres of light hovering in the sky. I couldn't figure out how high they were, but they were bright enough to make me slow down and stare. It definitely wasn't an airplane or helicopter, and I knew that for a fact. As I kept driving, these lights seemed to move with me, like they were pacing my truck. Every time I sped up, they matched my speed. If I slowed down, they slowed too. I tried to tell myself it was some weird atmospheric reflection, or maybe military flares, because this wasn't far from some testing sites. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The strangest part was how quiet everything got. Usually, even in the dead of night, you hear the rumble of the engine, the whistling wind, something. But it felt like all of that was dampened somehow. My headlights started flickering, which made my pulse race because it's never a good sign when your rig acts up in the middle of nowhere. Then the engine sputtered like it was about to die, and I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the orbs shot directly overhead, and I felt this intense vibration, like static electricity washing over me. My whole body tingled, and I swear for a moment I couldn't move a muscle. It was like being frozen in place, conscious but completely paralyzed. My vision blurred, and it was like time slowed to a crawl. I heard this faint buzzing like a high-pitched hum deep inside my ears, and then everything went completely dark, like someone had pulled a curtain over my eyes. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt endless. When I came to, I was parked on the side of the road, engine off, and my hands were still on the wheel, trembling. The orbs were gone, and the highway was once again bathed in that eerie moonlight. My first thought was that maybe I dozed off, but my gut told me something else had happened. My watch, this old wristwatch my dad gave me, had stopped working altogether, frozen at 1:17 a.m. The weird part was, I had no memory of pulling over or killing the engine. Everything was hazy, like waking up from a nightmare you can't fully recall. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, and I felt damp with sweat despite the cool night air. I got out of the truck to stretch my legs, trying to shake off this creeping sense of dread that clung to me. The desert around me was silent, which is normal for that stretch, but it felt too silent, if that makes any sense. I kept looking up, expecting to see those lights pop back into view. I even walked a few yards away from my rig, shining a flashlight around, half expecting to find some kind of scorch mark or debris. But there was nothing, just me, a silent highway, and that endless expanse of desert. Even though I was alone, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching me from just beyond the darkness. I climbed back into the cab, trying to steady my breathing, and turned the key to see if the truck would start. For a moment nothing happened, and the silence pressed in on my ears like a heavy weight. Then all at once, the engine roared to life. But the headlights flickered a bit before settling into their usual glow. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to grip the steering wheel just to keep them still. The road ahead was empty, and I couldn't see a trace of those strange orbs anymore. Part of me wanted to just stomp on the gas and get the hell out of there. But my mind was racing with 1,000 questions. What had I really seen? And why couldn't I remember the minutes leading up to me pulling over? I tried to check the clock on the dashboard, but it was blinking nonsense digits almost like it had been reset. That old wristwatch I wore was still stuck at 1:17 a.m., though by my guess it had to be closer to 2. It felt like I'd lost a chunk of time somehow. I also noticed my left arm was itching more than usual near the elbow, but I brushed it off as nerves or maybe a mosquito bite. My skin felt prickly all over, and the cab had this faint metallic smell that I couldn't recall being there before. I took a deep breath, shifted into gear, and eased back onto the highway, hoping I could just put distance between myself and whatever I'd experienced. The engine rumbled along, sounding normal enough now, but my gut was still in knots. Every few seconds I found myself glancing in the side mirror, half convinced that those lights would be trailing behind me again. It's like a part of me refused to believe the encounter was over, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what over meant at that point. All I knew was that something had happened out there, something I couldn't explain. I kept driving for a while, forcing myself to focus on the road. The desert night can be disorienting, with miles of nothing but scrub and rock and the occasional lonely gas station sign. I remember passing a run-down rest stop with a single flickering fluorescent light. It reminded me how isolated I was. Nobody around for miles, no other headlights in sight, no one to turn to if something bizarre happened. Again, I thought about pulling over at that rest stop. Maybe to check the truck or just splash some water on my face. But I felt this overwhelming urge to keep moving. Like if I stayed in one place, the orbs would find me again. My mind kept racing, through possibilities. Had I been drugged, or had a micro-sleep, or was this some kind of stress-related hallucination? But none of that explained the quiet hum, the paralysis, or the sudden darkness that swallowed me up earlier. My body felt strangely tired, more than the usual late-night fatigue. I also noticed this lingering headache that pulsed at the base of my skull, like a dull throb that wouldn't go away. The air in the cab still had that odd metallic tang, which made me wonder if something had gotten inside my truck. At one point, I flipped on the overhead light and caught a glimpse of myself in the rear-view mirror. My face looked pale and drawn, eyes wide like I'd just seen a ghost. The hair on the back of my neck was still standing on end, and my heartbeat thumped so loudly it felt like I could hear it echo in that small space. I tried fiddling with the radio, hoping a station might come through with some music or even static. Just something to ground me. But all I got was dead air, like the signal had been wiped clean. That's when the fear really hit me. Maybe my sense of reality had been tampered with, and I had no idea how to fix it. After driving for what must have been another half hour, I felt another wave of vertigo, as if the horizon was tilting. My eyes struggled to focus on the white lines painted on the road. I decided I couldn't keep going like that, so I pulled off onto a wide shoulder. The night was still dark, the moon hanging low, and the silence was overwhelming again when I cut the engine. My chest felt tight, and I was shaking, not from cold but from sheer anxiety or maybe shock. I forced myself to step out and walk around the front of the truck, shining my flashlight around the hood to see if anything looked off. That's when I noticed a faint discoloration on the metal, almost like a grayish film near the top of the windshield. I ran my finger across it, and it tingled like static electricity, making the hairs on my arm rise. I had no idea what could leave a residue like that, but it gave me a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced at my arm again, remembering the itch, and rolled up my sleeve under the beam of my flashlight. That's when I first saw it. These small, circular scratches, not very deep but distinct enough to form strange little rings. There were maybe 3 or 4 of them, almost evenly spaced. My heart nearly skipped a beat because I knew I hadn't bumped into anything, and I sure as hell didn't scratch myself like that. It looked deliberate, almost like a pattern. I felt a rush of panic then, because it confirmed my worst fears. Something had happened during that missing time, and I didn't have a clue what it was or why it left these marks on my skin. Standing there under the desert moon, I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to just get away from that spot. My heart was hammering, and the cool night air did nothing to calm my nerves. I kept shining my flashlight on those strange circular scratches, trying to see if they formed any recognizable pattern, like letters or symbols, but they just looked like small rings etched into my skin. I touched them lightly, and the spots were tender, almost burning at the edges. My mind went back to that moment I'd lost all sense of time. Was I unconscious for minutes? An hour? The fact that my truck's clock and my wristwatch both got messed up made it even more unsettling. Part of me wanted to chalk this up to exhaustion, but there was no denying the physical marks, or that weird residue on the windshield. My body felt heavier than usual, and every muscle was tense, like I'd just been through some kind of intense ordeal. I did a quick walk around of the truck, scanning the tires, checking the cargo, even climbing halfway up the side to look at the roof. Everything seemed intact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the entire rig had been tampered with somehow. It was like stepping into your own home and feeling that someone else had been inside while you were gone. You sense it before you see it, and the sense was all around me at that moment. The desert was still empty, with no sign of other vehicles passing by, so I realized I was completely alone with my fear. The only source of light besides my flashlight was the waning moon, which made the shadows stretch in odd ways across the asphalt. Every little movement in the corner of my eye set my nerves on edge. I found myself scanning the sky, waiting for another flash of those orbs, half terrified they'd appear again, half desperate for answers. After a few minutes of standing there, I forced myself back into the cab. My head was pounding, and I was starting to feel this odd ringing in my ears. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a faint whistle you can't quite place. I knew I had to keep moving if I ever wanted to make sense of this, so I started the engine again. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I pulled back onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. My mind was stuck on what could have happened during that blackout period. Did I get out of the truck? Was I taken somewhere? Or was it all some twisted hallucination that left physical marks? As the miles rolled by, every bump in the road made me flinch, like I expected the truck to stall out again or for those lights to drop out of the sky. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself that if I could just make it to the next town, I'd find a phone booth or a diner where other people were around. Any place that felt safer than this endless desert. But the more I thought about it, the more isolated I felt. This was 1962, and while technology was advancing, it's not like I had any way to radio in an encounter with what looked like UFOs. Who would I even call? The police? The local newspaper? I pictured their faces if I tried to explain what had happened. They'd either laugh me out of the station or lock me up for rambling like a lunatic. so I focused on driving, 1 mile at a time, fighting off the shaking in my arms and legs. My ears still buzzed, and my vision felt like it had a slight haze around the edges, but I was determined to not let that paralyze me again. If something was going to happen, I wanted to be awake for it this time. The highway stretched on, and I was desperate for any sign of civilization. Eventually, I spotted a flicker of neon in the distance. Turned out to be a small truck stop, one of those old-school places with a couple of pumps and a dingy little diner. Relief washed over me, even though it looked practically abandoned. I slowed to a stop by the pumps, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment trying to gather my thoughts. The place was barely lit by a single street lamp, and the neon sign buzzed with a pale glow, half of the letters burnt out. I looked around for another truck, another car, but there was nothing. Even so, I decided I'd rather be there than out on the open road if anything strange started happening again. I stepped out, expecting to see someone, maybe the night attendant, but the station seemed deserted. The office door was locked, and the diner next door had the lights off, except for a single bulb flickering inside. I remember the air smelling stale, like old grease and dust. My arms still burned where those scratches were, and I felt this unshakable sense that I was being watched. I had to force myself to walk around, peering through the windows to see if anyone was inside, but all I saw were empty booths and a couple of flies buzzing around the overhead lights. The normalcy of that scene was comforting in a weird way, but it also felt totally out of place given everything I'd just experienced. I couldn't decide if I was relieved or disappointed that I didn't see another living soul. All I knew was that I was still in the middle of nowhere with a truck that had been acting strange and a head full of questions that I couldn't answer. I hovered near the entrance of that diner for a while, pressing my face against the glass in hopes of spotting some sign of life. The interior looked like it hadn't been updated in years, with torn vinyl on the seats and a couple of plastic menus lying on the counter. A broken clock on the wall read 4:12, though I had no idea if that was even close to the real time. My watch was still stuck on 1:17, mocking me with that frozen moment I couldn't remember. My arm ached around those circular marks, and I finally noticed a faint redness spreading from the scratch rings. It looked like a rash, or maybe an allergic reaction, but it didn't feel like any rash I'd had before. The skin felt tight, almost feverish. I took a few slow breaths to steady myself, then scanned the desolate parking lot, thinking maybe someone was around back, but it was just more emptiness. The wind kicked up some loose gravel, making a soft scraping sound that set my nerves on edge. I leaned against one of the gas pumps, trying to piece together how I'd ended up in this surreal situation. Part of me questioned every little detail. Were the orbs real, or was I having some kind of breakdown? But my gut kept reminding me of that moment of paralysis, that static-like vibration coursing through my body, and those missing minutes that left my truck idling on the side of the road. All the logic I tried to throw at it just bounced off the memory of that bright, unearthly glow. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I imagined how vulnerable I was out there. A lone truck, a deserted station, and an encounter that I couldn't wrap my head around. Even if I wanted to call for help, there wasn't anyone to call. And a payphone, if it existed around here, would probably just connect me to some half-awake operator who wouldn't know what to do with my story. The thought of going back out onto that pitch-black highway made my skin crawl. But staying there alone in the dead silence wasn't exactly comforting either. Eventually, I decided to try the truck stop's restrooms, which were usually in a separate building off to the side. Maybe I'd find a sink to wash my arms, or at least get a moment to compose myself. I followed a cracked concrete path around the side of the diner and found a small structure with a flickering light bulb above a door marked Men. It was unlocked, which at least was a small mercy. Inside, the fluorescent tube buzzed loudly, casting a sickly yellow glow over a stained sink, a mirror with a spiderweb crack, and a single stall that looked like it had seen better days. The place smelled of mildew and old urine, but it beat standing in the parking lot staring at nothing. I splashed some lukewarm water on my face, then cautiously rolled up my sleeve to get a better look at those marks in the mirror. I nearly dropped the flashlight when I saw how the scratches seemed even more pronounced under that harsh fluorescent light, like they'd grown in size or depth. Each circular ring looked raw, and they were spaced so evenly it was unnerving. I tried to run some water over them, hoping to soothe the sting, but the contact just made them throb angrily. That's when I noticed small flecks of something dark, maybe dried blood or some kind of residue, around the edges of the wounds. My mind immediately went back to that weird film I'd seen on my windshield. Were they connected? The realization made me feel nauseous, like my body had been tampered with by something I couldn't even begin to understand. My reflection in the mirror looked haggard, my eyes sunken as if I hadn't slept in days. My shirt was stained with sweat, clinging to my back in patches, and I realized I was trembling so much it was almost a struggle to keep my flashlight steady. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to will away the panic, but it clung to me as if it was a physical presence. Once I gathered enough courage to leave the restroom, I headed back to the truck. The air outside felt somehow heavier, and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel seemed amplified in the silence. It was as if every sound had become magnified, making my heartbeat echo in my ears. I stepped up onto the running board and hesitated, my hand on the door handle, thinking about what might happen if I stayed in that cab, or if I drove off into the darkness again. Either option felt loaded, with possibilities I didn't want to explore, but I had to do something. So I climbed in, slammed the door, and locked it out of pure instinct. The smell of that odd metallic tang still lingered, faint but impossible to ignore. It made me think of electrical wiring or heated metal, but there was a strange undertone I couldn't place. I turned the key, and the engine coughed before roaring to life, sending a shudder through the entire vehicle. For a split second, I expected the headlights to fail or the dashboard to go haywire again, but everything stayed on, though the radio remained silent, as if the airwaves themselves had been swallowed by that desert. I glanced at the passenger seat and noticed a thin layer of dust, which was odd because I'd wiped it down earlier that day. It almost looked like ash, light and powdery. I brushed my fingertips across it, feeling a static tingle that raised goosebumps on my arms. It was the same prickly sensation I'd felt earlier, and it shot my anxiety right back up. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to decide if it was safer to wait for sunrise or keep moving. Something in me just couldn't stand the thought of being a sitting duck in that abandoned lot. So I flicked on the headlights, took a deep breath, and eased onto the empty road once more, feeling a deep pit in my stomach that refused to go away. As I drove, I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept circling back to the strange events of the night. Every little bump in the road, every flicker of the headlights felt like the precursor to something worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in the cab. It was like the space around me had changed somehow, as if something had been left behind. Something invisible but very real. I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching the endless stretch of asphalt, but I couldn't help the sensation that something was following me, even if I couldn't see it. The desert night was still, too still, and the air seemed to thicken as I drove further away from the truck stop. It felt like I was moving through a void, like the world around me was suspended in some other dimension, disconnected from reality. Every now and then, I would glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those 3 glowing orbs again, trailing behind me. But there was nothing, just the deep blackness of the night. It was then that I realized the truck was humming softly, almost imperceptibly, like some low frequency vibrating through the frame. It wasn't the engine. It was something else, something far subtler. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to press against my skull, like the sound was in my head. My hands were starting to feel clammy again, so I gripped the wheel tighter. My eyes were darting between the road and the mirror, scanning the empty highway for any sign of movement. Every time I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, I would whip my head around, but there was nothing. I was just driving in circles of fear, trapped in a perpetual loop that had no way out. I didn't stop again until I reached a small town, about 60 miles further along. I needed gas. And frankly, I needed a break from that quiet terror that had followed me. The whole ride felt like I was walking a tightrope between sanity and the so unknown, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The gas station was open, though the attendant looked half asleep behind the counter. It was a small, run-down place, much like the truck stop I had left behind, but it was bright and filled with the hum of fluorescent lights. I felt like I was stepping back into reality, if only for a moment. The attendant barely acknowledged me as I pumped the gas, his eyes glazed over like he was stuck in his own world. I could feel the weight of my experience pressing down on me, but I didn't know how to explain it. I thought about asking if anyone else had seen anything strange, but I couldn't get the words out. The scratch marks on my arms still itched and burned, and the buzzing in my ears hadn't let up. I paid for the gas in silence, and then climbed back into the truck, my hands still trembling. I couldn't shake the image of those lights, the way they had followed me, the way the time had slipped away like sand through my fingers. The truth is, I didn't know what had happened to me that night, but I knew I would never be the same. No amount of driving would erase the memory of that cold, unnatural stillness or the eerie, heavy silence that filled my head. I could feel it inside me, this strange disconnect between what I knew and what I had experienced. I drove for hours after that, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my mind racing to make sense of everything. It wasn't until days later that the marks on my arm began to fade, but the sensation of being watched never really left me. The silence was still there, even when I was surrounded by people. I went to a doctor about the scratches, but he couldn't explain them. He suggested they could have been from a brush with a thorny bush or something, but I knew that wasn't it. There were no thorns on the road, and the pattern was too perfect. He ran a few tests, but the results came back clean. No signs of any kind of exposure to radiation or anything that could explain the odd tingling sensation in my skin. That was the last time I ever mentioned it to anyone. I never told anyone about the lights in the sky, the buzzing, the strange paralysis. They'd think I was crazy, and maybe I would too if I hadn't lived it. Every time I thought I could move on, that night would crawl back into my mind, dragging with it that deep, unshakable fear. I would never forget those lights, the way they hovered and followed me, the way the world seemed to stop, as if time itself had been stolen. And those marks, those perfect circular scratches, they stayed with me in a way that still makes my skin crawl. To this day, I don't know what happened or what it means, but I do know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't of this world. I never went back to that stretch of Route 66. I couldn't. The memories, the fear, it all seemed too real. I took different routes after that. Any excuse to avoid the place where it all happened. But the feeling lingered, I'd catch myself looking up at the sky, waiting for those 3 orbs to reappear. Sometimes I'd hear that faint buzzing in the back of my head, a reminder that whatever I'd experienced was still out there, waiting. It's been decades now, and I'm no longer the young man I was back then. But that night, it hasn't left me. The scars on my arm faded, but the fear never did. It's always there, just beneath the surface. If you ever find yourself driving alone at night, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, keep an eye on the sky. You might just see something you can't explain. And trust me when I say you'll wish you never did. Second story, the encounter on the Trans-Amazonica Highway, Brazil, 1973. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. It was around midnight, and I was driving alone on the Trans-Amazonian Highway. The road was quiet, nothing but the sound of the engine and the occasional chirp of insects echoing through the dense forest on either side. There was something about that night that felt off, too still, too silent. I had been on the road for hours, and the isolation of the place was starting to get to me. Out here, you're more likely to see animals than cars, and I've learned to respect the solitude of the highway. But what happened next I can't explain. I first noticed the light in the sky. At first it looked like any other star, just a small dot in the distance, but then it started moving. Not like a plane or a shooting star, but more like it was coming straight at me. It was bright, almost blinding, and it seemed to grow bigger with every second. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to think, but instinctively I reached for the brakes. As I pressed down, the truck didn't respond. The engine sputtered, and then everything went silent. I tried everything, pumped the brakes, flipped the lights, but nothing worked. The road ahead was still dark, and the trees blurred in the corner of my vision. That's when the light grew even brighter, almost like it was consuming the truck. It wasn't like any headlight I'd ever seen. This light was otherworldly, cold and electric, cutting through the dark like a laser. My hands froze on the wheel, and before I could make sense of what was happening, I felt it, a pressure building up around me, an invisible force that made it hard to breathe. My body felt numb, like it was being pulled in different directions. I looked around, panicked, but I couldn't move my arms or legs. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on, but all I could do was watch as the light enveloped the entire cab of my truck. Then, everything went black. When I came to, I was no longer in my truck. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I could feel the disorientation coursing through my body. The first thing I noticed was that the air was different, thick and sterile, like a hospital room. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. The panic set in immediately, a cold, unrelenting wave that washed over me. I was laying down, but I didn't know on what. It wasn't the truck's seat, that's for sure. It felt smooth, metallic, almost like I was on a table or slab of some kind, and I couldn't see the edges. I tried turning my head, but the moment I did, I realized I was no longer in the world I knew. The space around me was strange, blurry at first, but as my vision adjusted, I could make out the walls. They were metallic, but the surface wasn't shiny like steel. It looked almost matte, textured in a way that I couldn't understand. There were no windows, no doors, nothing that would suggest I was in anything resembling a normal room or vehicle. It was as if I had been placed in a room that didn't belong in any physical reality. My thoughts were racing, but at the same time, I felt detached from them, like I wasn't fully in control of my mind. That's when I saw them. At first I thought they were shadows, figures standing in the far corners of the room. But as they came closer, I could see them clearly. These beings weren't human. They weren't even close. Their bodies were slender, almost unnaturally so, their limbs elongated in a way that felt wrong to my eyes. Their heads God, their heads were massive. They were disproportionately large compared to the rest of their bodies, smooth and round with an eerie pallor that made their skin look almost translucent. There was no hair on them, just these oversized heads with wide, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. I felt my breath catch in my throat as they drew nearer. I couldn't make a sound. My body refused to cooperate, and my mind was a swirl of confusion and terror. But as they closed the distance between us, I realized something I couldn't explain. I understood them. They didn't speak in any language I knew. They didn't need to. It was like their thoughts were in my head, clear as day, as if they were speaking directly to my mind. Their voices, if you could even call them voices, weren't like anything I've ever heard. It wasn't sound. It was more like a feeling, a deep knowing that flooded my consciousness, drowning out everything else. The moment they began communicating with me, I knew I wasn't just experiencing something out of the ordinary. I was in the presence of something far beyond anything I could comprehend. Their thoughts, sharp, unsettling, spoke of things that didn't belong in this world. There was no kindness in their message, no empathy, just cold, clinical information that seemed to flow directly into my brain. They showed me images, flashes of landscapes I didn't recognize, of stars and worlds that felt impossibly far away. I could see them, hear them, but none of it made sense. They didn't need to explain what they were doing. They didn't need to say a word. I could feel it in my gut, deep in my bones. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. It was wrong. I didn't know what they wanted from me, but I knew it wasn't something I could escape. And then, one of them stepped forward. The others lingered, their eyes boring into me like they were studying me, an insect under a microscope. But this one, the closest, came closer still, almost too close. It reached out, and I felt something cold and metallic press against my skin. It wasn't physical. It was like it was reaching inside me. That's when everything went dark again. When I woke up again, I was back in my truck. I don't know how it happened, but I was sitting in the driver's seat, my hands still gripping the wheel as if nothing had changed. The truck was just as it had been, but something felt off. I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. I wasn't sure what time it was, but the dashboard clock told me it had been almost 6 hours since I had last checked. 6 hours. That didn't make sense. I knew I'd only been out for a few minutes, maybe less. There was no way 6 hours could have passed. I checked the road ahead, empty, dark, just as it had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I glanced down at my hands and they were trembling, not just my hands, but my whole body. I had trouble keeping my eyes open, like I hadn't slept in days. I felt drained, like someone had siphoned the life out of me. I wanted to leave, I wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to start the engine. I just sat there staring at the road, unable to move. Everything felt wrong. But it wasn't just the truck. It was me. Something inside me was different. Something deep. Something I couldn't explain. As I sat there, my mind racing, I started to remember more. Bits and pieces of what happened came back, like images in a dream that were just on the edge of my memory, slipping away every time I tried to hold on to them. The beings, the room, the cold feeling pressing down on me. It was all too much to comprehend. But it was real. I knew it was real. And yet, when I looked around, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The truck, the road, the trees. They all looked the same. But I felt changed. I felt watched. I couldn't explain it, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. It was like I wasn't alone, even though I was. I didn't dare look behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. I wasn't just scared. I was terrified. I felt like I was being hunted, like something was out there waiting for me to make a move. The fear in me grew worse as the minutes dragged on, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that time was slipping away, that I wasn't supposed to be there. It was like something was calling me, drawing me in, but I didn't know what. My mind was a mess, my body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't even focus on the road anymore. I glanced at the clock again, and it was the same as before. 6 hours had passed, but it felt like I'd been sitting there for only a few minutes. I knew something had happened to me. I just didn't know what. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen, but eventually I was able to gather enough courage to start the engine. The truck roared to life, but even as I drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. I kept looking over my shoulder, my eyes darting around, waiting for something to appear. It was like the world around me had shifted. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the question that kept echoing in my head. What had they done to me? And why? I didn't tell anyone about what happened. How could I? No one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I even believed it myself. I couldn't explain the 6 hours that were missing. It didn't make sense. My memory of the event was patchy at best, fragments of images, feelings, and that overwhelming sense of being somewhere I shouldn't be. And then there was the coldness. The way it felt like I was no longer connected to the world, like I was a spectator in my own life. Even after the encounter, it stayed with me. The unease, the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. But I went on. I kept driving. I had to. I couldn't just sit there, stuck in that moment forever, but every night after that, it haunted me. Not just the memory, but the feeling of being followed. It felt like the light had never really left, like it was always hovering just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, and I swear I could still feel those eyes on me. I didn't talk about it, not to anyone, but it was always there, this feeling that whatever happened wasn't over. It wasn't until years later, when I was back on the road again, that I heard someone else's story that made my skin crawl. A fellow trucker, a guy named Marcos, told me about an experience he had on a remote stretch of highway, almost identical to mine. He talked about a light in the sky, the strange loss of time, the paralyzing fear, and how when he woke up, hours had passed just like me. His voice trembled when he spoke, and that's when I knew. What happened to me wasn't just some freak accident. It wasn't a bad dream. Other people had experienced it too. He didn't get into the details the way I did, but just hearing him talk about it, knowing that someone else had been through what I went through, it made the whole thing feel so much more real. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It wasn't just some weird moment in time that I misinterpreted. Something had happened that night on that road, and I wasn't the only one who'd been touched by it. The more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that the experience wasn't isolated to just me and Marcos. As time passed, I started to hear about similar encounters from other truckers, mostly in the same remote regions. It wasn't always the Trans-Amazonian Highway, but it was always in places far from civilization, where the night seemed endless and the air thick with isolation. The details varied. Some spoke of seeing strange creatures, others mentioned hearing odd noises, but the common thread was always the same: the light, the missing time, the feeling of being watched. I can't explain it, but it started to feel like there was something about these roads, something about being alone out there that made people vulnerable. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't just coincidence. It was like we were all being pulled into something we couldn't escape, something beyond us, beyond our understanding. And no matter how many years went by, I knew that night wasn't the end. Something had changed in me, and I don't think I'll ever fully understand what that something was. I never saw the light again, never encountered those beings or that strange metallic room, but I couldn't forget the feeling. It stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind, especially when I was out on the road late at night, driving through stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever. The trees, the darkness, the quiet. It all started to feel like a trap, like the road was never truly empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, that something was always there, just out of sight. And no matter how many years passed, the unease never went away. I kept going back to that night, trying to piece together what happened. But it was always like trying to hold on to a dream that slipped further away, the harder you tried to grasp it. But even if I never fully understood what happened, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't the same after that night, and neither was the world around me. I still drive to this day, but I'm not the same man I was before. There are nights when I'm on the road and I feel like I'm being watched. It's not just a feeling, it's a certainty. The trees, the empty stretches of highway, they seem different now, like they're hiding something, or like they're part of a bigger, darker reality that I'm not meant to understand. I've seen other truckers who seem to know something, even if they won't say it. They get nervous when they drive through certain areas, their eyes darting nervously to the skies, checking their mirrors more than they should. I don't talk to them about it. I don't need to. We all know. There's a reason why we're all drawn to these desolate roads, but there's also a reason we're all afraid of them. No one talks about it, but we all feel it. We all know there's something out there that's watching us, waiting for the right moment to make us part of something much bigger than ourselves. Maybe it's the isolation that makes it easier to believe in things we can't explain. Maybe it's the endless empty road, the way the trees seem to stretch on forever in the darkness, the soft hum of the truck's engine filling the silence. But after what happened that night, I can't escape the thought that there's something more out there than what we see. It's almost as if the silence is hiding something, something that watches, waits for the right moment to pull you in, to make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. When I'm driving through stretches of highway late at night, when the moon is just a sliver in the sky and the world around me is swallowed up by darkness, I feel it. It's that same pressure, that same unease that I felt the night I first saw that light in the sky. The world feels wrong, like I'm being watched by something I can't see but can feel deep in my gut. And every time I close my eyes, I can still feel it, like a weight pressing against my chest, as though something's lurking just out of reach. I can't explain it, and I'm not sure anyone would understand if I tried. But I know what I felt that night, and I know what's still with me, lurking just below the surface. It's not just in my head, it's real, and it doesn't care if I believe in it or not. And that's the worst part, the feeling that no matter how far I drive, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that stretch of road, it's never really gone. So, if you ever find yourself out there alone on those long, desolate roads in the dead of night, be careful. You don't know what's out there. You might think you're alone, but that's the lie. I thought I was alone that night, just another lonely trucker crossing through the middle of nowhere. But I was wrong. Whatever it was, whatever those things were, they weren't just in my mind. They were real, and I wasn't just a passenger. In that moment, I was part of something. Something bigger. Something far beyond what we can comprehend. There's a reason why some roads seem to stretch on forever, why some places are quieter than others. Because sometimes that silence isn't empty. It's full of waiting eyes, of things that know we're coming, that know we'll be passing through, and that we'll never be the same once we do. I can't tell you what'll happen if you see that light in the sky. Maybe you'll be one of the lucky ones, and it'll just be another strange story to tell. But if it happens to you, if that light gets too close, if you feel that pressure start to build around you, don't try to fight it. Don't try to outrun it. It doesn't follow the rules. It doesn't play fair. And when it's noticed you, when you've crossed that line, you'll never truly be alone again. You'll carry it with you. And the worst part is, you won't even know when it's watching. It'll just be there, waiting. And you'll know deep down that you're part of something far darker than you could ever imagine.
If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
Third story. The Sonoran Desert Case, USA, Mexico, 1975. It was the middle of June, and the heat in the Sonora Desert was unbearable. The sun was setting, casting a red-orange glow across the barren landscape as I drove my rig through the vast, empty stretch of road between Arizona and the Mexican border. I'd been doing this route for years, and the miles always seemed to stretch on forever, the isolation swallowing me whole. But that night was different. It started with something small, a flash in the sky. I thought nothing of it at first. It could have been a reflection, a trick of the light from the truck's dashboard, or even some strange light pollution from nearby towns. I kept my eyes on the road. But then it moved. It wasn't just some distant star or reflection. The light, a bright, almost blinding white, began to shift, and before I knew it, it was hovering right above my truck. My heart started racing as I instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. The engine sputtered. The lights blinked out for a second. I tried to flick them back on, but nothing. The radio went silent, and a deep, unnatural cold filled the cab. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just the air conditioning. This cold was different, something otherworldly. As I looked up, the light hovered there, motionless, almost like it was watching me, observing me. I tried to pull over to the side of the road, but the truck wasn't responding. The brakes weren't working. It was like my rig was being controlled by something, or someone, other than me. I pressed harder on the pedal, but nothing happened. The engine stalled completely and I was coasting, but it didn't feel like it was from my own doing. The road, empty and vast, seemed to stretch out further than it ever had before. The strange light stayed in place, and that's when everything seemed to blur. My head, it felt heavy. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I fought to stay awake, to stay alert, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My eyes grew heavier, and I swear I could feel something unseen, pulling me down into the darkness. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming sense of disorientation before everything went black. When I finally woke up, I had no idea how much time had passed. The truck was still on the side of the road, engine dead, but everything was eerily still. The lights, those same bright lights, were gone. The desert around me was silent, almost too quiet. I felt like I had just woken from a deep sleep, but it didn't feel like any nap I'd ever had. My head throbbed as I tried to make sense of what was happening, but there was nothing. No explanation. The worst part, the truck's tachograph. It showed a reading of over 80 miles more than what I had actually driven. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. I hadn't passed any towns, hadn't seen a single car. There was no way I could have covered that distance, especially with the truck malfunctioning like it had. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, that maybe I was just too tired, but deep down I knew what I'd seen, that cold, the light, and the feeling. It wasn't normal. And the worst part, my skin. There was a mark, a small, almost circular indentation on my arm. At first I thought it was some kind of irritation, maybe from the seatbelt, but it was too perfectly round, too precise. And over the next few days, it disappeared, as if it had never been there, at all. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the deserted road ahead. The sense of time lost, of something unnatural having slipped into my life, lingered in the air like a bad smell. I tried to get the truck started again, but it was as if the vehicle itself was still in a daze. Nothing worked. I had no choice but to wait until morning. But the desert felt different. It wasn't just the quiet, it was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The temperature didn't rise. The air stayed cold, like the sun had been swallowed up and replaced by something else. As the hours crawled by, I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. I couldn't even figure out how long I'd been out. Was it hours? A day? The thought of that light above me just sitting there made my stomach churn. Was it waiting for me to wake up? I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't just been some weird phenomenon. Something had happened, something had been done to me. By the time the first rays of sunlight hit the horizon, I was a wreck. My mind was frayed, exhausted from the constant looping of thoughts. I checked the time. My watch seemed normal, but something in me felt off. I couldn't even trust my own perception anymore. My body felt strange. I moved like I was underwater, sluggish and uncoordinated. I tried to stand up straight, but the dizziness came back in waves. My eyes wouldn't focus, and I had to blink repeatedly to keep from losing control of my vision. I managed to get the truck started somehow, but it felt wrong. The engine hummed, but it wasn't the same hum I was used to. It was softer, almost distant. I couldn't explain it. I kept driving, hoping that the further I went, the more I'd be able to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. But no matter how many miles I drove, no matter how fast I pushed the pedal, I couldn't outrun the feeling that something had changed in me, that I had been marked. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. It sounded insane. Who would believe me? I couldn't even make sense of it myself. All I had were the strange readings on my truck's tachograph, the inexplicable cold, and that damn mark on my arm that had vanished without a trace. But when I walked into the small diner for a cup of coffee, something caught my eye. There, sitting at the counter, was another trucker, an older guy who looked like he'd been on the road longer than I had. His eyes met mine for a moment, and there was something familiar about his gaze. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave me sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Had he seen it too? Had he experienced something similar? I left the diner as quickly as I could, but as I got into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had been touched by whatever that thing in the sky had been. The memory of the night, the feeling of the cold, the confusion. It stayed with me. And to this day, I still don't know what happened or why I was chosen. I just know that whatever it was, it left a mark on me that I can't forget. The weeks that followed were a blur. I kept pushing myself to forget about the event, telling myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by fatigue or the isolation of the desert. But no matter how much I tried to move on, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something had changed in me. I found myself looking up at the sky more often, expecting to see that same blinding light, and sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I did. In the middle of the night, when the world around me was silent and still, I'd feel a strange pressure in my chest, like I was being watched, like they were still out there waiting for me to slip up. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the fear of what I couldn't remember, what had been taken from me. And the worst part, the feeling never went away. The nightmares started to creep in. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, unable to recall the dream, but knowing it had something to do with that damn light. One day, I found myself in a small town along the way, and the sense of dread hit me again. It was like déjà vu. I was getting fuel at the local gas station when I overheard a conversation between two men. They were talking about a trucker, a man who'd gone missing in the desert a few weeks back. A sudden rush of blood to my head almost made me drop the nozzle. I tried to play it cool, but I was listening intently. The details were chilling. The man had been driving through Sonora, just like I had when he disappeared. No one had found any signs of him, no tracks, no evidence of a struggle. It was as though he had just vanished. They mentioned something about strange lights in the sky, but they quickly brushed it off as a weather anomaly. I couldn't bring myself to ask any questions. I just filled my tank and left, feeling that same oppressive weight on my chest, the same feeling I had that night. I don't know if it was just coincidence, but my skin crawled thinking about it. How many others had seen what I had? How many of us had disappeared without a trace, only to return like nothing happened? That night, I parked my truck in a roadside motel just outside of town. I couldn't bring myself to sleep. My thoughts were spinning out of control, all those fragments of memory mixing with the creeping dread that something was out there, watching, waiting. I kept the curtains closed tightly, even though the room was small and poorly lit. I wanted to shut out the world, to keep whatever it was away from me. But the fear didn't stay outside. It crept in, filling the room until I couldn't breathe. And then, just as I thought I could finally drift off, I heard something. A low hum, almost like a drone, distant but unmistakable. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen. It was the same sound I'd heard that night in the desert, just before everything went dark. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence. I didn't move for what felt like hours, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. The hum got louder, and I swear I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It wasn't real, I thought. It had to be a trick of the mind. But then I heard it again, and this time it was closer. I didn't know what to do. The fear was so intense it paralyzed me. I wasn't sure if I should get up, check outside, or just hide under the covers and pretend this wasn't happening. The sound was unmistakable, like a soft, steady buzz that seemed to resonate in the air around me, making everything feel wrong. My heart was racing as I lay there in that dim room, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The hum had a rhythm, almost as if it were alive, and it filled the room with a heavy presence, like something invisible was just beyond the walls. I couldn't shake the memory of that light from the desert, how it had followed me, how it had watched me. I could almost feel it now, right above me, lingering in the space between wakefulness and sleep, as if whatever I had experienced was still hunting me. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming for me to ignore it, but I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I needed to know if the light was still out there. I cautiously approached the window and peeked through the gap in the curtains. Outside, everything was still. The moonlight cast long shadows over the desert, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no light, no movement. Yet the hum continued, now vibrating through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. It felt like the whole world was bending around me, closing in, forcing me to confront whatever this was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't fully understand, something that was far beyond anything my mind could grasp. I stepped away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. I thought about leaving, about driving as far away as I could, but a strange sense of paralysis kept me rooted to the spot. It was like my body didn't belong to me anymore, like it was being pulled into something I had no control over. That light, that cold, the sensation of time lost. It was all still with me, deep inside, gnawing at my soul. I had no answers, no explanations. All I had were the memories, and they were more terrifying than anything I had ever encountered. As the hours passed, the hum finally faded, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that strange light. The way it hovered above my truck, the way it seemed to consume everything around it. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to let go. When morning came, I packed up my things and hit the road again, but it felt different. I felt different. It was as if the desert had taken something from me, something I couldn't ever get back. The sun rose in the east, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, but it did nothing to lift the heavy weight that had settled over me. The truck's engine ran fine, but the familiar hum of the road felt alien now. I kept thinking about the man I had overheard at the gas station, the one who had talked about the trucker who went missing. Had he been talking about someone like me? Had the same thing happened to him and he was just too scared to admit it? Or worse, had he been lost to whatever force had claimed my sanity that night? My thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in my arm, right where that mark had been. It was subtle, but it was there. That same spot, the same odd feeling. I looked in the mirror, but I didn't recognize myself. The man staring back at me seemed like a stranger. Days passed, and I tried to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the feeling never went away. There were nights when I would wake up, drenched in sweat, convinced that I was being watched. The light in the sky was still there, sometimes faint, sometimes blinding, but always present. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the stars, a misinterpretation of the weather, anything to explain it away. But deep inside, I knew the truth. I had been touched by something I didn't understand, something that had taken my time, my memory, and had left its mark on me, both physically and mentally. I couldn't escape it. The feeling of being connected to something beyond our world, something far older and more powerful than anything we could imagine, never let me go. I'd be driving along a lonely stretch of road, and out of nowhere that familiar hum would start again. Just faint enough that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I wasn't. I knew. I wasn't alone. And the worst part? I couldn't ever shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there were others like me. Others who had been chosen or marked, or whatever it was that had happened to me. What if this wasn't just some isolated incident? What if it was part of something bigger? I eventually went back to the town where I had overheard the conversation about the missing trucker. Something inside me pushed me to find answers, or at least try to understand what had happened. The gas station was still there, run by the same old man who had greeted me the first time. I tried to ask him about the missing trucker, about what had been said that day, but he just brushed me off like it was nothing. But when I left, I saw that same man again, sitting outside the diner staring off into the desert. His eyes met mine, and once again that unsettling feeling washed over me. He looked at me as if he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't ready to hear. But he didn't speak. I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was as if I had come full circle, like the whole thing had started and ended here in the middle of nowhere, in the dry heat of the Sonora Desert. Had I really experienced all of that? Or had it been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, by the desert itself? I couldn't tell. I wanted to forget it all, but the mark, the memories and the feeling of something being out there, just beyond the horizon, never left me. The final straw came when I found something in my truck. I had been cleaning out the cab when I discovered a small metallic object wedged between the seat and the door. At first, I thought it was just some piece of junk, but when I held it in my hand, I knew instantly that it wasn't ordinary. It was cold, too cold for something left in the truck for so long, and it had markings on it, strange symbols, almost like a language I didn't understand. I didn't know where it had come from or how long it had been there, but I knew one thing for sure. It was connected to what had happened to me. The abduction, the missing time, the strange lights. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. And when I looked closer, I noticed something else. There, near the base of the object, was a small, faded mark, exactly where the strange mark had been on my arm. The same place, the same size. I had been marked, without a doubt. And whatever had happened that night in the desert wasn't over. I don't know how much longer I can live with this. How long I can keep pretending like it didn't happen. Every night, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold and hear the hum. I don't know what they want from me, what they did to me, or why it happened. But I know it's not over. The mark on my arm might be gone, but whatever happened to me that night in the Sonora Desert is still with me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on before it drags me back into its darkness. The light, the hum, the cold, they're all part of it, and I don't know how to escape it. I don't even know if I want to anymore. The truth is, I'm scared, and I don't think I'll ever have the answers I need. So, if you see anything, like I did, if you ever feel that same cold or hear that hum, please don't ignore it. You're not alone. I don't know why, but you're not.
So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.